back with the boy at the back of the class. Just my little boy there in the background, just interfering, written by Anjali Rauf. We are up to chapter 13, and this one is called The Something That Changed Everything. The night after Amit had told me about his sister Syra being in the sea and not knowing if his mum and dad were alive, I had trouble going to sleep. Mum always tells me to count sheep when I can't sleep, but I find sheep too funny. They look like clouds with legs, so I count leopards instead. They're colourful and look serious. I can't remember how many leopards I've counted to, but it must have been more than 200 before I eventually drifted off. By the time the morning arrived, I was so tired and my legs moved so slowly that when I got to the bus stop it was late, and Tom and Josie and Michael had already left. I didn't really mind because getting the bus on my own is fun. I like watching the people passing by on the streets outside or making guesses about the people sitting next to me. Last week there was a huge man sitting right at the front of the bus, snoring so loudly that he was making all the windows shake. Everyone was watching him and giggling or shaking their heads at him. But what if he had been a world-famous snorer on his way to the International Snoring Championships and was practising his best snore? You just never know. That morning I was too sleepy to look at anyone and guess stories about them, so I leaned my head on the large window and listened instead. There were always lots of noises on a bus, especially when there are lots of people going to work and trying to get to school, but it's usually noises like the doors opening and closing and people ringing the bell and tickets beeping on the ticket machine. Nobody really talks to anyone else unless they're with friends or asking for a seat. Uncle Lenny says it's because we're English, and English people would rather die than have to speak to someone they don't know. I think I can't be very English if that's true. The bus had passed 2 stops, and except for a baby who was making loud gurgling noises, it was nice and quiet. I think everyone must have been as sleepy as me. But then at the 3rd stop, a woman dressed in a bright yellow coat and a man dressed in a suit came and sat in front of me, and picking up the free newspaper lying on both their seats, began talking loudly about all the things they were reading. At first they talked about the economy being broken by rich people who weren't paying their taxes and hiding all their money away in a place called offshore. Then they talked about a princess who was going out with an actor they didn't like and a famous singer who'd been arrested for hitting someone. I was starting to fall asleep again when the man suddenly said something which made me sit up in my seat and listen just as hard as I could. "Oh, ain't it horrible?" the man said. "Look at what they're saying about refugees. Border restrictions as of next month. I knew this would happen." The woman shook her head, looking over his shoulder at the paper. "Those poor people. Where are they meant to go? Back to that nightmare they left behind? Or left to starve in France?" "Cheaper for us to leave them in France," said the man, shaking his head. "Says here the borders will be closed by the end of the month. So that's all the racists made happy then." The woman tutted. "Rescuing kids out of the sea one minute and then telling them they can't be helped the next. Some of them might have family here, the poor things. That should count for something." The man read the newspaper for a few more seconds and then said, "Well, apparently not. Says here we're already taking in a few hundred, so we're not going to take in any more. Doesn't matter how little they are." It was my stop. As soon as I got off the bus, I ran as fast as I could to school. My heart was beating so loudly that I could hear it in my ears, but I didn't care. If what the man said was right, then after next month, Amit's mum and dad would never be allowed into England, and Amit would never be able to see them again. I needed to tell Tom and Michael and Josie about what I'd just heard, and I had to tell them everything without Amit hearing. But when I reached the school gates, the bell for registration was already ringing, and the playground was nearly empty. I ran to the classroom just before Mrs. Khan started to take the register. She looked at me with a frown, but didn't say anything. "Where were you?" whispered Josie. "We waited until the 2nd bus came." I was too out of breath to say lots of words, so I just said, "I slept late." That morning, Mrs. Khan put us into 2 big groups so that we could write a play on the story of Romulus and Remus and then act it out. It's a legend about two baby boys whose mum hid them in a basket and sent them far away so they wouldn't be killed by people who were jealous of them. I guess they were refugee boys like Amit, except Amit's mum didn't put him in a basket. He came in a boat. Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsley said Amit could join the class on this project, so Amit and Tom were put in my group and Michael and Josie were put in the other group. I was trying to think of how to let them know of what I'd heard when Mrs. Khan told everyone to get a piece of coloured paper and a special handwriting pen from her desk so that we could write out our lines. I decided to take an extra piece of paper, and while everyone was busy looking through their workbooks to find out which character they wanted to play, I quickly wrote a top-secret message. It said, "I heard something on the bus. We mustn't tell Amit about it. Meet me in the library at break time. Top secret." I folded the message up until it was so small that I could hide it in my hand, and when Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsley weren't looking, I passed it to Tom. Tom looked around, and when nobody except me was watching him, he opened it up and read it. Then he gave me a nod, and pretending to need another piece of paper, went up to Mrs. Khan's desk and gave Josie the note on the way back to his seat. Then I saw Josie read the note and quickly pass it to Michael, who dropped it on the floor. But luckily, everyone was too busy writing their lines to notice, and he snatched it back up again. He looked over at me and gave me a thumbs up, and then stuffed the top-secret message into his pocket. As soon as the bell for the first break began to ring and Mrs. Khan told us to leave everything where it was, I ran to the library room and waited outside. It was the one place in school no one ever tried to go into at break time. A few minutes later, Josie and Michael came running up the corridor. "Tom's in the playground with Amit," said Josie. "We can fill him in later." "What did you hear?" asked Michael, his eyes wide. I quickly told them everything that the man and the woman on the bus had said about no more refugees being allowed into the country. And then what Amit had told me about his mum and dad being left behind. I had to tell them about his sister Syra too. I felt bad about breaking my promise, but I knew that Amit wouldn't mind me telling Josie and Michael about it, because this was a real emergency, and they were his friends too. "You mean, if he doesn't find them before the end of the month, then Amit might never see his mum and dad again?" gasped Josie. I shook my head. "Not once the government closes the border gates." "Yeah," said Michael, "they're like giant airport ones with loads of police and guards protecting them. You can't go through them when they're closed, or you get put in jail." Michael looked at his watch and pressed a button so that it lit up and showed the date. "If they're closing all the gates at the end of this month, that means he's only got 9 days to find them." "What do we do?" asked Josie. "I say we tell Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsley. They'll know what to do," I said. Michael and Josie agreed. We ran to the staff room and knocked loudly on the door. We're not supposed to disturb teachers in the staff room at break time, because that's where they go to drink lots of tea and find answers to questions that they can't find in the answer books. I know because Josie's aunt is a teacher, and she told Josie, who told me. But Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsley had told us to go and find them if something was wrong. And this something felt like the most wrong something I had ever heard of. After a few seconds, Mr. Gaffer opened the door and looked down at us with a frown. He's the deputy head, which means he's in charge on the days Mrs. Sanders is away. But Mrs. Sanders is never away, so I don't really know what he does. "Yes?" he asked. "Please, sir, we need to see Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsley immediately," I said. "It's an emergency," added Josie. "Is it really?" he said suspiciously. We all nodded our heads at least 10 times. "All right, just hold on," replied Mr. Gaffer as he closed the door. Josie twisted her hair nervously around her finger and stuffed a whole chunk in her mouth, and Michael started kicking the wall lightly as we waited. After what felt like 20 whole minutes, we couldn't really have been more than one, Mrs. Khan and Miss Hemsley came to the door. "Is something the matter?" asked Mrs. Khan. "Is it to do with Amit?" We all nodded again. Miss Hemsley and Mrs. Khan stepped out into the corridor and closed the staff room door behind them. We all started talking at once. Mrs. Khan held up her hands and said, calm down now, one at a time, please." "Miss, the government are going to close the gates," I began. Josie said, "and Amit's mum and dad are on the other side. They might get stuck." And there's only 9 days left until the gates close, said Michael, showing Mrs. Carn his watch. Mrs. Carn and Miss Hemsey looked at each other and they looked back at us. What do you mean by gates? Asked Mrs. Carn gently. You know, the gates at the edge of the borders, said Michael. The ones where all the police with the big guns are. The refugees have to come through them to get into the country. Ah, said Mrs. Carn. And where did you hear they were being closed? Was it on the news? I told her about the man and woman on the bus. I see, said Mrs. Carn. She was quiet for a moment, and I saw her give Miss Hemsey another look. Then she said, It's a lucky boy to have such caring friends, but you don't have to worry at all. His foster mother, who you've seen coming to pick him up every single day after school, is there to look after him until his family can be found, and she's working with some very clever people to try and help Amit find his family just as quickly as possible. We all looked over at each other in surprise. So the woman in the red scarf was Amit's foster mum. Everything was beginning to make sense, and all our questions were being answered too. Clever people like who, miss? Asked Michael. Well, clever people from the government, said Mrs. Carn. And lawyers and some wonderful kind-hearted ministers who are working in Parliament, and charities too, said Miss Hemsey. That's right, agreed Mrs. Carn. They're doing everything they can to make sure Amit's mum and dad are found. That's their job. But what if they don't find his family before they close the gates? I said. Miss Hemsey and Mrs. Carn smiled, but they didn't smile with their whole faces, so I knew right away that they were pretend smiles. Everyone's doing everything they can, said Mrs. Carn again. Miss Hemsey nodded and then, looking at me, asked, Amit spoke to you about his family and what happened to his sister? I nodded, but suddenly felt nervous. I promised Amit that I would keep it a secret, and I hadn't. Miss Hemsey smiled and said my name softly. That's a very good thing, she said. A very, very good thing. Sorry about him in the background. The bell rang and Mrs. Carn made us promise not to upset Amit by talking about the border gates or telling anyone else about his sister. We all promised. And Mrs. Carn said, Everything will be fine. You'll see. I nodded, but I didn't think she sounded very sure. In fact, I didn't think everything was going to be fine at all. Not if Amit didn't find his family before the gates closed. That afternoon we told Tom what had happened, and we all came to a decision. We were going to try and help instead. And to do that, we would need to go on our very first ever top secret mission. Ooh, I wonder what that top secret mission is. I hope you enjoyed that. Did you enjoy that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll see you tomorrow.